We will be looking at an exercise called CSS-replicate-stats-marketing. So you can find that on GitLab. I have it cloned already, and you'll see. I'll jump into that a little bit later in the session. Okay, cool. So the first thing I wanted to touch on was how to use reference images well. Can we have something different from the picture, such as some spacing? Ideally, you should match the images as closely as possible, and that goes for your work in assignment 1 as well. So I'll touch on that now with this point. So, someone on the forum, Hugo Walker, I want to say, made this post about how you can use the reference image to help ensure that your solution is as close to correct as it can be. So basically, he recommended putting this in your CSS file for each task. He goes a little overboard. You don't need to do all of this. You can get basically the same effect with only 2 lines of CSS, which I'll show you. But if you want to go through the full thing, you're more than welcome to. So what I will do, I'll have to swap my screens. So I can take you over to the VS Code window. So just bear with me. Alrighty. Can everyone see VS Code now? Just so I make sure that's working. Can someone give me a thumbs up or anything? Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Okay. Cool. So let me just get started off here in the index HTML thing. I'll just set up some boilerplate HTML. So if you haven't started the assignment yet, this is something that you might not be super familiar with. So pay attention to this part. This is basically something that you can repeat for any HTML files that you do. You don't need this doc type. It's just a sort of formality thing. You need your opening and closing HTML tags, and then you normally have a head section. So the head section is where you link to your style sheets, for example. So we'll do that now. So I've created a styles CSS file here. It's empty at the moment, but I'll just chuck in a link to it. So what you have to do is you have to type in link and then the relationship, sorry, that's autofill, is the relationship is style sheet, and then you basically just provide a path to the file. And because this is all in the same directory under this my solution thing, that's all you need for that. So that's all we really need for the head for now. And I'll just put an empty body tag here. So the body is where the main content of the page will go. And now, so I was talking about using the reference image well. So basically, what you want to do is you want to go into your style sheet, and you can put this with the pseudo selector. You can put this before, or you can just put it as the body. Both will kind of work to different effects. I'll do what Hugo did on the forum for convenience's sake, so I don't confuse any of you. But yes, so what you want to do is you can do something like, the most important thing is you want to set this background image property. And if you're not quite sure what this is building to, just give me a minute, it will make sense. And so, where are we? And so yeah, I set the background image to be our reference image. So this page.jpg, this is the page that we're trying to replicate, right? So I'll set the background image to be that, and then it's often a good tip to set the opacity to be something like 0.5. And that should more or less get you there. You can use a couple of the other tags that he's done. You know, you can set background size to be cover. This stuff is all in that forum post, and it was on the slide as well. You You can set the position manually if you want. So I'll just put everything that he had basically, so that you can see what it does. And he set the height and width to be the height and width of the reference image, basically, which is also makes sense because that avoids having any background repetition problems. There are other ways to solve that, some of which Emily would have shown you in the tutorial last week, using something like background repeat, no repeat, like that. But because we've set the size of this body before to be equal to the size of the image, we're not going to have any issues with tiling backgrounds or anything like that. All right, so then how do you open this up? There's a thing that I use, it's an extension called Live Server on VS Code. So this thing, basically. So this lets you really easily work with HTML and CSS pages. I would recommend installing it, particularly for assignment 1. It will save you some time because you don't have to then refresh the page every time you make a change. The changes will propagate automatically, which is very helpful. So let me open this up with Live Server, and that's brought up this window here, which is hang on. Why is that being annoying? Where am style CSS? Ah, sorry, I called it index CSS. That's why that didn't work. My bad. Where did I? All right, let me try running that again. And oh wait, no. What did I do? No, it was sorry. Okay. What did I do here? All right, that is interesting. Normally, that works. Let me just try. It might be because of sometimes there are slight differences with there we go. Okay. All right, cool. So, oh whoops, sorry, I didn't want that. There we go. All right. So, what were our dimensions? They were, height was, oh, sorry, this was for assignment. This was for the assignment. That's why that wasn't being weird. All right, let me look at, okay, 1907 by 937. All right. So, sorry for the delay. That's there now. So now we're looking at our HTML, our empty HTML document, which has a background image of the image that we're trying to replicate. So whenever we now go and actually start to build this, we'll be able to see it overlaid onto this background image, and we'll be able to see where any discrepancies are. And I would honestly really recommend doing this for your assignment if you aren't doing this already, because we do tend to be a little pedantic marking wise when it comes to how accurate, and not too pedantic, you know, we're not going to be unreasonable, but as close a match as you can get, the less likely it is that you'll lose marks for not being particularly accurate and that sort of thing. So yeah, I would recommend doing this and get it to line up as close as you can. Alrighty, let me split screen it so that we can sort of go through both of these. Oh, that's going to be annoying, isn't it? All right, never mind. That's going to be difficult to split screen. So I might just have to tap between the two because the dimensions won't work out. All right, cool. So that's that one. Let me just quickly flick back to the slides so we can carry on. Where are we? Let me start that share again. Okay, so we've got the reference image there. So we've done that. And so now I want to look at how we break up an image and how we go about actually getting started replicating an image in HTML and CSS. So this is our image that we're trying to replicate, right? And essentially what we're trying to do is, what you want to do when you see something like this is you want to try and break it up into boxes or shapes as much as you can. And so you can see that there's kind of a box here at the top where this navbar is, and then this orange panel here on the left, that's a box, and then we sort of have these three boxes here. So if I click over, you can kind of see that I know the colors are sort of painful to look at, which is part of the point, I suppose. But yeah, so there you go. You can break this up into boxes, and now each one of those boxes can become a div, essentially, when we're going through and actually making this in HTML and CSS. Now, there are a couple of boxes here that I haven't actually shown because there's a lot of boxes and boxes within boxes and that sort of thing. So that's something you have to sort of develop an intuition for as things go on. Let's move on. Let's forge on, and you'll see an example of what I mean. So again, I'll bring across VS Code, and so let me get rid of that. Okay, so looking at our reference image up here, we see, well, what do we see? We talked about how there was a box for the navbar, so let's create that navbar box. So we'll say div, for example, class equals navbar. And that navbar has this little hamburger menu. So these three bars, that's called a hamburger menu for context. So that's what I'm referring to it as, I guess, because it looks a bit like a hamburger with the two pieces of bread and then something in the middle. Now you can actually get a character that looks a bit like that. So I'll grab that in a second. Actually, for the sake of convenience, I'll call this menu icon. And let me just sneakily grab that from there, chuck that in. So that's basically just a Unicode character, you know, it exists. Otherwise you could, something that we'll teach you a bit later in the term is how to actually generate something like this using what's called an SVG. But that's probably definitely material for later in the term. Alrighty, so that's the navbar. And now just a quick point, just a quick refresher in case you guys are still a bit unclear on this. When do we use classes and when do we use IDs? We use classes when there's any chance that we might use something more than once, or when it's not, it might not be a unique element on the page. So for example, we've got that navbar. Maybe in this website we're building, there might be other pages that also need a navbar, so it makes sense to have a navbar as a class. But if we're making something that's really just one-off, super specific for just this page, that only appears once on the page and would never appear anywhere else, then it makes sense to give that an ID tag instead of a class ID attribute, sorry, instead of a class attribute. There's no hard and fast rules about it. As long as what you've done kind of makes sense, you won't, or you shouldn't lose too many marks for it. But yeah, just be aware if it's something that you think could be reusable at all for anything else, give it a class. That's the general rule of thumb with that one. Okay, so that's the navbar. And then we have this orange panel and this right-hand panel. So what we'll do is I'll wrap both of those panels in a div, and you'll see why in a minute. And then I'll make a separate div for each panel. And it's sort of just divs all the way down from that point onwards. So I might have a div. In this case, I guess it's, you could go either way for ID on class on this one. I think either would be justified. I'm going to go with class because it makes sort of a bit more sense to me, but you could do an ID for this and it would be fine. Call this left panel. And then we have our header text h1. Can give that a class like, I mean, you can sort of call it whatever you want. I'm just going to call it left panel header. And it says making an impact 1 cup at a time. Cool. So we have that in the left panel. And then we also have this set of squares, the last one of which is filled in. So what I'm going to do there is I might put that in its own little box too, just so that we can more easily group them. Again, once we touch on the next tip and look at how we're going to style these things, that will make more sense. But for now, just bear with me. So I'll call that div class, I'll call it dots container. And then I'll have a div, these dots, squares, whatever you want to call them, these are definitely classes because they're reused across the same thing. You wouldn't want to give this an ID. So I'll call this one square. And how does it have a, cool. All right, square. And we might just leave this as an empty div for now. That's okay, square. And then for the last one, because it's filled in, we might chuck in a second class, which is, say, filled. And so then when we're actually doing the CSS and the styling for this, it will still have all the attributes of the squares, like the other squares, like this empty square with the transparent middle, but then that transparent middle will be filled because it'll also pull styles from this filled class as well. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's the left panel. And if you want to see what this looks like on the in our little thing at the moment, oh god, what were the dimensions? There we go. So you can see we have, let me zoom in a little. And don't worry about the, and I'll fix that tiling in a second, but you'll see that we have our little hamburger menu icon here. We have our text here. The squares won't show up because they're just empty divs at the moment. But yeah, that's what it looks like right now. Okay. Alrighty, and let me just get rid of that repeating background. So you'll see, since I've made that background repeat no repeat, we no longer have that issue of the background tiling. So little tip there. Alrighty, cool. So now that left-hand side panel is done, so let's take a look at the right-hand panel, which is where this exercise, I think, gets actually quite difficult. Also, in general, if you guys at any point have any questions, please feel free to unmute, cut me off, post something in the chat. Literally, whatever works best for you. So yeah. Cool. So now we'll do the right-hand panel. So right-hand panel, this set of boxes here. Let me just make that a little bit bigger so you can see. So we're doing these ones here. So when you're looking at something like this, you want to say, okay, what's common? What can I sort of abstract out, in a sense, into a div or a class that I can just reuse? So you'll notice, putting aside this, so I mean, obviously they all come in these boxes, and the top box is distinct in that it has this header text. So there are a couple of ways you could approach this. One way would be to have a separate container that just had this top text, and then have three divs all with the same class name that dealt with the equipped to fight climate change, save from landfill, and buy drinking segments of the page. Or you could include the so far we have in the topmost box. Either would work. They'd be a bit different styling wise. So I'm going to do the one where we include the so far we have in the in that topmost box. I'm not going to do a separate container for it, but just know that you could definitely do a separate container, and that would still be a way to make that work too. If it would be maybe a tad bit more finicky to do that. Alrighty. So that right hand panel, I'll say we have a div. We're going to give this a class. I'm going to call it stats box because that seems as reasonable a name as any to me. And that looks, so we previously used our header h1 here for this big text. This text, the so far we have, that looks a fair bit smaller to me size wise. So maybe that would make more sense as a h2. H2. So far we have ... And I won't give this a class now. I want to show you some of the other ways that we can reference this stylistically as well. Hopefully we have time for that, but if not, it's in the solution as well, so you can see it there. All right, so far we have, and then there's a bit of a gap there, so we might chuck a break tag in. And then, okay, so now, okay, so again, you can sort of decide where you want to split this up. You could decide to include the equipped to fight climate change in your box, or you could decide to have that above the box and just have a separate box just for containing this bit. I think personally that doing a box that just contains everything below the little header of equipped to fight climate change might make life easier, because what's happening is it'll just be easier to line things up properly, because it's closer to being sort of one line. You'll see an example if you play around with it. It's sort of something that you'll build an intuition for what might be easier. But yeah, so we will see. Oh, in case you haven't seen the break tag before, sorry, I did not introduce that. The break tag just basically it just starts whatever content's coming next on a new line, so it adds a little skip or a break. And it's what we call a self-enclosing tag. That's why it has the slash there. So you know, you're probably used to seeing stuff like div, like there's an opening div tag and then a closing div tag, but some tags like break are self-enclosing, so they don't have a opening or closing. They just exist like this because there's no pairing element. Alrighty, so those next headers about equipping to fight climate change, those look even smaller, so we'll put it h3. Capitalize everything. Equipped to fight climate change, and I think there's a colon at the end of that. There's not, no big deal, we'll fix that up later. And then we'll have our repeatable stats box, like actual stats components. So I'll call this stats because this is where the stats actually come in. Oops. And now we'll chuck in something like, okay, so now it's time. I think it will make sense to go back to the slides now because there's some important concepts that I want to drop and some knowledge that I'm going to drop on you kids. So let's move on to that. Alrighty, we've talked about this. Getting the right colors, we'll come back to that one. Okay, flex boxes. So if you haven't used flex boxes before, they're kind of amazing. I'll post a link to these slides in the chat afterwards if you want them. But in the meantime, there's this really great link, flexbox.malvern.co. I'll copy that and put it in the chat if any of you want to bookmark it. It's a really handy visual guide to how to use flex boxes properly. So yeah, I would say keep note of that and keep it on hand because it takes a while to remember how all the different flexbox commands work. So, okay, let's talk about this for a second. So what we have in this little stats box is we basically have two sides of it. And this example is a bit different because I've included the save from landfill here, but it doesn't really change if you pretend the box closes here. So you have a container, this white background, and then you have an element on the left and an element on the right. Now, and like with a space in the middle. Now, the easiest way to achieve that effect is to use flexboxes when you're styling them. So what that means is you'll basically want to set the CSS styles for this box to be display, and then you'll want to use the justify content property and set that to be space between. So justify content basically says, how do you want to space out the items that live inside this flexbox? So a flexbox is just a div, basically. And obviously divs have child elements, stuff that lives inside the div. And so flexbox and justify content in particular ask you, okay, how do you want to space out those elements, right? And so space between says basically, put as much space between the elements as you can. There are some other ones which are space evenly, so which, as you can sort of imagine from the name, spaces things out pretty evenly. And there's another one, space around, which says put as much space on the outside of the elements as you possibly can. So that might push things into the center, if that makes sense. So why I came to this is because what this will mean is that you need to house these two things in separate divs, essentially. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, you'll see. Because each of these, okay, we'll come back to that one. But basically, yeah, each of these needs to be in separate little containers, so that they can be, the container needs to group the things that you want to put on the left, and then another container or another div has to group the things you want to put on the right. So let's go back to VS Code. And let's implement that. So we're inside our stats box now. So we'll have now our stats left container, and we'll have our stats right container. And these two divs will house what we want to go on the left-hand side of the box and what we want to go on the right-hand side of the box. So stats left, okay, that's some pretty big text for the 191K. So that I'll put that under a H1 tag. That's 191K. And then there's a little units tag as well, which is square meters. So that's what's happening on the left. And then on the right, we have just what looks like, it's not really a header. So it should just get a paragraph tag. And then we'll say, okay, that has off elders, valley, land, full stop. Okay. And so that's the basics of setting up the HTML for this. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. So what I'll do now, what you can do now with this stats box, just to save some time, I'll just paste it twice over. So now we have 3. Yeah. All right. Cool. Cool. So that's happening there, and if you're curious what this looks like now, it doesn't look like much. But so you can see at the moment, without any styling, this doesn't really. I mean, it just goes down the page in this very sort of linear way, which is not really what we're looking for at all. But I think you'll see that once we start putting the CSS in, this will actually transform pretty rapidly. So. Alrighty. Unfortunately, Zoom doesn't let me share multiple monitors, so this might be a little hard to follow. I'll try and bring across the web page to show as much as I can. But yes, just bear that in mind. And I do apologize for it. But yes, alrighty. Let me just check the. Alrighty. Is this even? Okay, never mind. Sorry, just checking something. Alrighty, cool. Let's start adding some CSS in. So a good little tip that I would say for putting CSS or adding CSS in, this is really helpful if you have a monitor set up, because then you can actually look at multiple screens. But if you're just looking at one screen and you have your code screen here, I would recommend putting your index HTML in like a little side panel like this, so you can easily refer to what your class names are, so you don't have to keep tabbing back and forth between the two, and you can look at both at the same time. So with that in mind, let's start. Where should we start? All right. Just looking at my notes. All right. Let's start with our body tag. So you see the body tag here. Basically, what we want to do, so there's a lot of common colors in this image, right? These oranges are all largely the same, and there's a lot of common like white colors and that sort of thing. So what's sometimes helpful is to, rather than having to put, for example, a text color for each different header style that you put in, is to just put a default text color in the body tag, and then all of the text components that are children of the body, so like all of them, if they don't have something set, they'll default to that orange color, which is kind of what we want, right? So first of all, let me just set the background color of the body to be, it's not quite white, but it's pretty close. If anyone doesn't know, you can actually shorthand hex color codes to just 3 characters, particularly if those 3 characters are all the same. So that can save you a whole second of typing. But yeah, so, and then now the color for the text, I have the key here, but basically, let me just show you how you might arrive at this just quickly. So if you want to figure out what the color of a particular thing is, there are obviously different ways to do this, but the one that I know and I used when I was doing this course was I would just load the image up in Photopea, and what you can do, just drop that image there, and there's a, where are we? Yeah, there's a little eyedropper tool here. You can just click on any particular field in the image, and then it will show you what that hex color code is, and also what the RGB color code is. So you can see it is what we had earlier in the code, so E86B01. So that's how I would do it for context. I'm sure there are other ways and other tools you can use, but that's the one that I know. And you can see even now that we've set that color in our styles, that the heading text here has become orange. This is our header text because it's inherited that color property from the body's styling. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if it doesn't. Okay, cool. Alrighty. So now let's go and let's style those headers. So there are a couple of different ways you can style. You can style header text. You can use points. So you could say I want my this is for style. This is for size. Sorry. You could say I want my header 1 size to be 70 points, and that's a valid sort of value to put in. You could also use these units called EMs or REMs as well, and you could use pixels as well. There is a conversion rate between all of them. If you Google it, you can find it. You can work with any of these. They're sort of interchangeable. It sort of comes down to personal preference at the end of the day. Now, because we are running a little short on time with only 18 or so minutes to go, I might just zip through setting these font sizes to the correct value so that we don't have to waste too much time on this, because it's not the real meat and potatoes of what this exercise is about. So just bear with me. I don't think we'll need to do anything with H3. All right, let's get into our classes. So remember our content container. Let me show you again in the image. Our content container class was the thing that houses all of this stuff, basically everything that isn't the navbar at the top, just in case. So hopefully that makes sense. And we'll want to set this to be a flexbox. So you make something a flexbox by putting display and setting that to flex in the CSS properties. Now, what I find useful is you want to set a flex direction. So a flex direction basically says, okay, within this div, do you want the elements to go down or across? And so what we want to do here, as you can see, because the content container contains, at the top level, it contains the left panel and it contains the right panel, right? So we have a left panel and a right panel. So our content is going from left to right, side to side. It's moving horizontally. So we want to set our flex direction to be row, because we're moving in a row, if that makes sense, across the thing. Now, flex direction is default set to row, so you don't need to include this, but I find it helpful. Just for clarity's sake, sometimes it helps you think. So I would recommend doing that. So now that we've got that going, let's take a look at our left panel. Let's take a look at our left panel. Okay, so now it's time to introduce something. So basically, you want to set these panels to be the appropriate width the appropriate size relative to each other, right? So you might look at this and go, oh, the left panel looks like it's taking up roughly 50%. The right panel looks like it's taking up roughly the same 50%, right? So what we can do is you can set both of these panels to have, you can just type in flex 1, and I'll put this for the right panel as well. And that will basically, because they're both set to 1, they will occupy an equal amount of space on the board. So let me just get rid of this for a second so it's not in the way. And now, okay, so now we're just looking at what we have. So you can see this left panel sort of cuts off at this 50% mark, and this right panel takes the rest of the page. Now, the thing that we want now, if you want to make the left panel, say, take up 2/3 of the page, then you might make this flex 2. Because now, if you want to think of it this way, there are think of it as like there are 3 boxes that go across the page, and the left panel occupies 2 of those boxes, and the right panel occupies 1. So the left panel will be twice as large as the right panel. It'll take up 2/3 of the page. So, and if we look, you can see that change sort of reflected. Now, as it so happens, I believe the values that we're actually looking for is that the left panel takes up 4/7 of the page. So you get something like this. Let's see if that's right. That looks around about right to me. It'll be pretty close anyway. Cool. Alrighty, so this left panel, I'll just keep that image there for reference. This left panel, this has a background color of that same orange shade that we had earlier, right? So remember, the default background color of the left at the moment is white because it's inheriting that white background color from the body styles. So we'll need to change that, and that will change the background color for the left panel and only the left panel. Alrighty. Okay. I'm just being conscious of time and the fact that we don't have all that much of it. Okay, so, all right. This is a fairly lengthy process to go through. Okay, so what's the most important thing to show here? All right, we've seen a bit of flex boxes. We're going to see some more of them. And I think that will be the main focus for today. So what I might try and do is, all right, let's quickly, you can actually use a flex box for the menu bar at the top. So what did we call that menu? We called it nav bar. Now here is an appropriate time to actually use percentages as a value when you're using CSS, because the nav bar extends all the way across the page. It covers 100% of the page, and so we can set it to 100%. Now, just be careful when you use percentages. This doesn't always relate to the page. This relates to if we say the width is equal to 100%, then the navbar will take up 100% of the available space in its parent container. So if it was in a container that only took up, say, half the space on the page, then it would take up 100% off half the space on that page. But because it's not in a container, it's just in body, it will take up 100% of the body widthwise, which is what we want. So you'll notice the navbar also has this border at the bottom. So we can, there's a property for that. If you just want to set a border at the bottom, you can actually go border bottom, just like there's border top and border left. There's, and all that's, and you can just use a general border tag too, that works too. But border bottom is if you only want to set a border on one specific side of the thing. And so we will set that to, that's 2 pixels, say, for example, because it looks pretty thick, solid, and the color of that border is also that orange, shade we had earlier. Alrighty. So let's see. So you can start to see that taking place here. You'll notice that there's a bit of a space on either side of the page, and the thing that's coming from is actually the fact that the body has a bit of a margin built into it by default. So what we can do to get rid of that is actually just set the margin of the body to be 0. And then you'll see that the spaces on the sides of the document have gone, which is what we want. Alrighty, cool. So that's that. Now we have to do the little hamburger menu. Menu icon. So that was a text character, so we can set the font size. Let's say we want that to be, I don't know, it's pretty big. Let's try 35 points maybe. And want that to be 35. What else do we want to do? All right, let's see where that lines it up for now. Let me get rid of this background image just for a second so we can actually see things. Okay, so that's put it there. So we want to shift this to the other side of the page, right? So a really helpful tool to do that when you're dealing with text is to use the text align property. So I could do if I do text align center, for example, let me pop back, you'll see that now this menu bar is in the center of the page. So if I go text align right, now it's been sent to the very right hand side of the page. Now we don't want it to be as close to the right hand side of the page as it is. We want there to be a bit of space between that right hand border and the actual thing. So what we might do is we might chuck a bit of padding, say padding right, 20 pixels, sort of eyeballing it. So now you see there's a bit more space there between the menu icon and the side. Okay. Cool. So that's that. Let me. All right. So that's obviously not quite aligned. So what's going on here? How would you find out? You might wonder, why is this hanging quite low? What you can do is you can actually look at what's happening in the page by using sort of the inspection tool in Chrome. So if I look, so we can see the navbar class here. So if I hover over menu icon, you can actually see that there are these big orange sections. So orange generally means there's a margin there. So if so you can see that if we look at the margin value for this paragraph, it's actually quite extensive, and that's why it's pushing this whole thing down. So what might be worth doing if we want to push that back up is we can then go, okay, well, the menu icon was the problem. Say margin. Let's see what happens if we get rid of that. Okay, cool. So that's been pushed a bit further up now, which is good. That may have been pushed a bit too far up, actually, because that may have been pushed. Yeah, because now, as you can see, there's still a bit of a gap between the two. So I might make that like, this is sort of just a guessing game. You have to tune it in. So now you see they're a bit closer together. That's something that you just sort of fiddle with and fine tune for this assignment. It's a bit tedious, I know, but you sort of have to do it. Now, you don't have to do it this way. You could have also done this using flexboxes if you wanted to. You could have you could have put this, you could have actually set the style of navbar to be flex. And then what you could have done is you could have said justify content, and then you could have said flex end, and that would have pushed it to the end of the flexbox, the right-hand side of the flexbox in that case, and that would have achieved a similar effect. So we did this with text align in this case, but if you're trying to put something that can't be done as a character, for example, then you might have to use flexboxes to achieve that effect. Okay, we have 4 minutes left and we are rapidly running out of time. So what I might do, first of all, again, you have access to these solutions on GitLab. So what may be a better use of our time is to just go over, okay, we've touched on that, Okay, yeah. Yep, you can do this with flexboxes. So I've done that here in this example on this page. Set the nav bar to be display flex direction row, justify content flex end, and then you can just chuck this menu icon up here, and it will automatically be pushed to the right hand side of the thing. Okay. All right. Otherwise, the rest of this task is largely fiddling around with your values until you get ones that you are happy with. I've walked you through the basics of how we want to do these boxes. Yeah, everything else should be much more approachable. And of course, you have the reference solutions there as well. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a leg up. I remember when I was doing this course, this task took me about 2.5 hours to do. So like it took me a while, and I don't think I ever got it quite right. So don't feel stressed or anything if you struggle with this one, because I know I definitely did when I was doing this course. So yeah, just in the 2 minutes we have left, are there any questions that anyone wants to throw while we still have some time?